Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining our career panel today. My name is Heido Adillo, and I am a second-year student at Stanford, majoring in Science, Technology, and Society. I will be the moderator for today. In this workshop, we will be exploring different ways to make an impact in environmental policy. The panel will be divided into two sections. In the first, we will ask our panelists a few questions, and in the end, we will have a Q&A session, so please type your questions in the Q&A box. I would now like to introduce our amazing panelists joining us today. Today, we have Dr. Janice Cumberbatch, who is a researcher and lecturer for social and environmental management at the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies. Felipe Verestagui, a green hydrogen specialist at the Ministry of Chile. And last but not least, Jasmine Rocco Predesi, who is a climate policy coordinator at the Environment and Natural Resources Foundation. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Now, to get started, I wanted to start off with a question for the panelists. What do you work in, and how did you arrive there? Jasmine, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you very much, Heidi, and thank you for the invitation. So my name is Jasmine, and I work, as she said, as climate policy coordinator at an NGO/think tank. I would say the same, because we have a double role, I think, in terms of producing knowledge products, but also doing advocacy work. And I was not very much sure of what I wanted to do when I finished my studies, but I knew that I wanted to do something with impact, and that's why, knowing Farn's work, I as soon as I got the chance, I started working towards getting there, and I was very lucky to have the opportunity to work with very amazing people there.
Thank you so much for that. Any other panelists who would like to join in?
Sure, I'll go next in terms of how I got here. And it's a very odd journey. I think I got here by serendipity. And I know I'm talking to students. So for all of you who are wondering where you're going and how you get there, it doesn't matter. You'll end up somewhere and it'll be the right place. I started, believe it or not, in sociology. And I did that because I wanted to do something to help people. That was generally what I wanted to do. And when I finished my first degree in sociology, I was then advised you should do a master's. I'm like, okay, so fine, but what do I do? And back in the days, because I'm like the oldest person here, we didn't have really cool ways of just going online and looking up universities. You actually sat in a library. I looked up books and books on universities, and I stumbled across environmental studies at York University in Toronto, and I had courses that looked interesting. So I tried that, literally. Got lucky in that one of the professors at the university in Barbados knew a professor at York. So I managed to get a scholarship, or I would never have gone. And I discovered the environment. I really, back in the 90s, yeah, I'm talking about 1990s, no one was really talking about it in Barbados where I live. So I stumbled on that. So I've got a degree in sociology, and now I've got a degree in environmental studies. And I came back home and it worked because I was able to bring a social perspective to the environmental field, which was largely inhabited by biologists and, people interested in natural things. And then I threw a degree in planning in there and a little bit of change management in there. What I'm saying is I put a sort of package together that allowed me to pursue keeping people at the center of environmental factors. But it wasn't like I planned it out or plotted it. Some of it happened literally by serendipity.
So maybe I can go last. But first of all, Heidi, thank you very much for the opportunity of being here, and I'm super glad to be part of this discussion. As you said, I currently work as a green hydrogen specialist at the Ministry of Energy here in Chile, where we've been working quite hard on deploying a hydrogen strategy that has been the focus of our work over the last years. But this is a place where I took a couple of turns before arriving to. I started with an industrial engineering degree. My background was mainly math. I was quite good at math at school, but I did not know how to make, let's say, like an environmental impact. I think that for many people here in Latin America, I am from Chile, so this is one example. Our relationship with the environment, it's almost a given. For us, it's almost part of our family tradition and culture. So that was always one major driver for me, but I was not sure how could I use, let's say, the methodological tools that I have developed to pursue environmental impact or help in sustainable development. So when I was done with my degree, I asked myself, how can I use these tools that I've learned to create some sort of impact or effect in the energy transition or moving to a sustainable society? And it's amazing to learn just how interested people can be if you start asking that question and try really to merge some fields which are more maybe classic engineering with social questions or environmental questions. I've found that there's always a good reception to that. And that's where I began my journey. And I spent a year researching energy systems using OR methods from the engineering school. Then I jumped into the Trade Association for Power Generators, where I worked for another year on regulatory studies. And then my final jump was to the Ministry of Energy, where I've been now 100% focused on policymaking. And it has been quite a fun ride. So happy to tell you a little bit more about it if that's interesting for you.
Thank you all so much for introducing us to a little bit more of the work that you do. Follow-up question to that would be, why did you choose to work in environmental policy through this approach, whether that be research, technology, politics, law, or activism?
If you want, I can start. So I realized I didn't say actually what I studied. I just jumped into the conversation that I didn't introduce myself. So just taking it back a little bit. So I studied environmental sciences at the University of Buenos Aires. So I come from a science, natural science background. And one thing that I realized, and I think it's also linked to this follow-up question, is that at least in climate change and climate change policy, there were a lot of people coming from social degrees, such as law, such as political sciences, that were afterwards, after getting those social degrees, working on more technical stuff related to climate change. And I didn't see so much the other way around, like people coming from sciences, then from natural sciences, and then going into policy making. And I always felt that was something that was missing. And despite coming from natural sciences, I was very much interested in policy, international relations. I actually almost studied in international relations. So I think that both things can be and should be very much intertwined in order to have effective policy making, especially in environmental issues. Well, I work specifically in climate change issues, but in both things, it is very much necessary. And regarding in the field that I'm working specifically on advocacy, but also, as I said, FARN is also a think tank. So we are also producing knowledge. Maybe it's not research to the level we could do in a lab. It's more in terms of what can we produce to help that policy making. And I think that I needed to do something that I found could have an impact. And that's why I chose that path. And both at the national level, but also at the international level in terms of UNFCCC and G20 and multilateral spaces.
So I'll pop up in the middle again. Why am I doing what I do? First of all, I teach as well as do research. And I'll keep saying this. I start as a sociologist at all times, regardless of the fact that I sit in a faculty that's called Science and Technology. I am a sociologist. And quite the opposite from Jasmine, I found that in climate change, which is the main issue for us right now, it was being dominated by physicists and geographers and the natural science people, and far less the behavioral science people, the people who were focusing on how to get society to change. So for me, it's a case of wanting to teach the next generation share my knowledge and learn from them, because I think teaching is a two-way thing. I'm learning as much as my students are learning. And my research is constantly focused on how to effect change. I started focusing, ironically, on solid waste. That's where my research started. But now it's looking more at how do different people, and especially the most vulnerable, women, the elderly, children, etc., how are climate change and other such issues impacting them? We know they're vulnerable. What needs to be done to improve their circumstances? Because certainly if we fix it for them, then the rest of us are pretty okay. And therefore, how do I work at getting messages across to the various levels? Because it has to change at the level of the politicians and the policymakers. It has to change at the level of the people who are the technical people, whether they're in the public sector, the private sector, or the non-governmental sector. So my focus in terms of my research is advocacy, it is change, it is how do you take what is essentially very maybe sometimes technical information and make it palatable to the and understandable to the average person, but more importantly, how do you do it in a way that they'll actually want to do something? How do you do it in a way that will make them want to change? Because it's all fine and good to talk about issues, and I think everybody here is very knowledgeable. You're not at a university because you're not smart. We can all talk about the issues, but after we finish talking, then what happens? That's what gets me going.
Wow, those are so interesting answers that I'm not sure how to compete with them, but I'll try and do my best. So for me, at least coming from Chile and working at a government agency on green hydrogen, there were a couple of questions that I wanted to, let's say, address when taking this approach to climate policy, because I know that probably most of all will be interested in at some level on sustainable development, but the question is, how do you choose a particular approach over others? And so for me, making that decision had mainly like 3 dimensions. One of them was a more technical one. So I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with Chile, but Chile is a country that has a vast amount of renewable resources and does not have such a large, let's say, energy demand. So electricity is actually going renewable at a quite fast pace. The power system is changing at a quite accelerated rate. And that's something that's being discussed over the last 5 to 10 years, and perceptions have shifted. So once we thought that 100% renewables was not feasible, and nowadays, if you speak with people from the industry, they'll say that that will be a reality in the next 10 years or maybe 15, but it's almost like a certain thing that will happen. And so then the next frontier for me was naturally addressing the rest of the energy system, which is not electric. So green hydrogen was a way of doing that on one hand, and also trying to reach parts of the globe that are beyond our scope as of today, being a country that is not so interconnected with its neighbors via power grids. So green hydrogen offered a technical possibility of creating a larger impact, and that was, let's say, the technical dimension of the decision. Then on a second aspect, I would say that the professional dimension was also quite important. So when I was invited to apply to this job at the Green Hydrogen Unit in the Ministry of Energy, I sort of took a look and saw that this was a very small and dynamic team within a large organizations, right? Governments are quite large organizations and are quite hard to change. They have quite a large amount of inertia. But once every now and then you come across a small team, which is very agile and dynamic and which is really driving things forward. And I think that those are places that you cannot miss out on. If you see a team that's within a large organization, but they have their own fast-paced dynamic and their own narrative, and they're very compenetrated, then that's something that's very attractive, and it's a place which is fertile for delivering change. That was also part of the decision. And maybe the last one for me, and this is probably something that's also applicable to many other countries, is that Chile is a country that it's undergoing a political and social crossroads on a major scale. We're currently writing a new constitution. We've had some couple of major crises over the last couple of years. And under that context, playing a role from the public sector was also something that I felt would be a good opportunity, not only to see and learn, but also to deliver messages and to help build a stronger narrative around sustainable development for the next couple of years. So that is why I chose this particular approach.
Thank you. Now looking forward into a couple years, how would you like to work in environmental policy in the future? Dr. Cumberbatch, would you like to get us started?
Right, in the future. When you're at my age, you're talking future, you're so close to retirement. You know, it's really interesting. I actually want to do something that is completely odd, probably, and totally what I have not done in my career. But I actually want to work at the level of the primary school, the youngest kids out there. I think that I've spent a lot of my career working with adults, and I've enjoyed adult education. It's been fine, you know, but I feel as if I could get started on really, really young minds and do a lot more work at that level. Perhaps I can effect change more efficiently. So I think writing more, not necessarily in the academic sphere, which is important, but writing more and producing material more that could educate the people who perhaps can put pressure on those who make the change. In other words, environmental policy is sort of a multifaceted thing, and you think about politicians and policymakers and like really important people. But I feel as if when you actually break down the anatomy of how policy happens and what brings about the change, and you look at many of the critical policies that have happened in the environmental or any other sector, there were some tipping points, there were some critical things that happened, and it was almost as if there was no choice in it and it had to change. And so I want to maybe step back a bit and be a little bit more involved in that part of it in terms of nurturing and nudging at the back end and pushing more. It's been interesting attending meetings at a regional and global level and talking at that level, but I feel as if I want to step out of it, and in the future, because you're talking about the future, I feel as if it's time for persons who are younger than me. I have a lot more energy than me to do what I've been doing for a long time, but maybe I can share my experience with a younger set. So yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to kids. Kids are really quite knowledgeable and interesting. They tend to keep you on your toes. My son has told me that, you know, we've pretty much made a mess of it. So why don't we give them a chance to, they can't do any worse. We've created climate change and all the rest of it. And I'm like, you know what, kid, you may have it right. So yeah, we've been working really hard at it for a long time. But I would like to see maybe a little bit more young blood, and I step back a little bit more and do a lot more nurturing. So producing writings and materials, videos, whatever that can encourage and nurture, you know, from the back end. That's what I see in my future.
Maybe I can go in the middle this one. So at least for me in the future, I think that I've come to realize that when you think about delivering change and you think about human systems, you realize that you have, of course, you have large organizations, but then you have some hybrid positions between them. So places that exist between the public sector and academia, or between the private and public sector. Those type of hybrid roles, I think that are quite interesting and actionable for one to deliver fast-paced change. When we're thinking about the critical situation that we're living in and the climate crisis, we really need to think about being efficient and being fast. And for me, when you start to reflect upon those key levers or key buttons that you can push within your career, I think that having like a pathway through those hybrid positions might be a good idea to really activate more than only one button at a specific location. I'm not sure if that's what maximizes impact, but it sure seems like an interesting plan for me. So I would love to work, for instance, I'm now at the public sector, but I'm also teaching classes at Universidad Católica in Santiago, and maybe further down the road, I'd like to work at academia and the private sector, and then go back to the public sector, making up a couple of changes of countries as well. just to get exposure to culture and to be sure that what we're doing here in Chile, it's not so crazy and so far away from what many other countries are facing. So I'm sure that from a global perspective, we can contribute more than from a specific location focused one.
So this is a really difficult question for me because I think that having studied environmental sciences, now working in climate change, I carry a lot of, I feel, weight of the responsibility. So I think it's still a struggle for me looking into the future and thinking, okay, what am I going to do and how am I going to change things? And I struggle with even continuing down this road a lot, like saying, okay, let's just move on to happier things and not think about this. And that's a very heartfelt thing that I feel. At the same time, I also feel the responsibility of the knowledge that I've gained through my education, through my professional experience. So I also feel like I need to carry on this fight that is so important for everyone. In terms of the spaces, well, I think that it is very appealing maybe to think about multilateral spaces such as the UNFCCC, such as the UN in general, in which one might think that it could change things, like we have the Paris Agreement now. And so what could we do from within? But at the same time, those spaces need to change a lot because they're not delivering enough action. And so I go back to thinking, okay, maybe I should try to think about more local things, like maybe working on government offices that are at the subnational level, which can actually do a lot and have a lot more contact with people, with their everyday lives than, for example, the national governments, which are very far away and delivering policies that are quite broad, whereas municipalities or provinces are really on the ground and dealing with everyday lives of their people. So that's something that I go back and forth, but of course I'm pretty open to whatever may come in the future.
Thank you. Now I would like to focus on the different ways to cause impact in environmental policy. How does your career impact advancement in environmental policy and in addressing environmental issues? To start off, I would like to ask specifically to Jasmine, what is the role of an organization like FARN in impacting environmental policy?
Yes, well, FARN has been working for many years now. I think it's 36 or 37 years ago that FARN was created. And we have been working a lot in terms of participation, public participation and public awareness, because the reality is that a lot of times people don't know what's going on with climate change, with environmental policies. And it's not like they can hold the governments accountable if they don't know what's going on or how they can have an impact, because maybe the everyday citizen thinks there's nothing I can do with this. It's bigger than me. It's something that it's only related to governments or companies or bigger entities than myself. And so working on public participation, working on having people know what's going on, how they can participate, how they can pitch in, because policy making should not be done only by governments. It should be done by everybody, like public sector, private sector, civil society, academia, because everyone is in the end impacted by those policies. So I think FARN works a lot in that sense, and environmental issues in particular are so important because they are definitely going to determine the future that we live in. So that's one thing that I think FARN can and has been working on a lot.
Thank you. Dr. Cumberbatch, I would like to ask you, what is the role of research in environmental policy?
So that's really easy, evidence. We have to be certain that the policies that we're designing and that we want to implement are the right ones, which means that we need to ground them in evidence. We talk about evidence-based decision making. And sometimes when we look at the decisions that have been made, when we look at the policies that have been put together, we're a bit concerned about whether or not they're the right ones. Research provides us with the opportunity to provide that baseline that helps us to design the policy, and it also helps us then to create milestones or benchmarks against which we can monitor and evaluate the implementation of the policy, change course if necessary, and determine how we can be successful in what we're implementing. So research is absolutely critical, regardless of what element of environmental policy you're talking about, whether we're talking about climate change and trying to, as we are in the Caribbean right now, really focused on adaptation. What are the best ways to adapt? You want to be very sure that the policy that you put in place doesn't have unintended consequences, because a policy may work very well in one way for one sector, but it can easily disadvantage another sector. And if you do not do the research, if you do not collect that baseline, if you do not have the evidence against which to monitor the implementation of your policy, you could be off on the wrong track. So it's absolutely critical to collect that data and to continue collecting information, collecting data throughout the whole process of policy design, policy implementation, policy review. I think another thing that I want to stick here is that policy isn't static. You don't design a policy and it stays as it is. The policy has to evolve and change. And again, research plays a critical part in that, because if we understand how the situation is changing, because as you implement your policy, in your environmental sphere, whatever, we could be talking about a marine spatial plan, we could be talking about a climate change adaptation measure for a fishery sector, it doesn't matter. As you are doing that, other things are happening in that arena or in other arenas that can have an impact. We recently, we've been through COVID, but that wasn't enough. We did COVID in the Caribbean. We do sargassum all of the time. We survive hurricanes and storms every year. And, we also from time to time have other threats. If we're not collecting evidence, if we're not doing our research and observing how things are changing, we can't put the right policy measures in place, and we can't be sure that our policies are being impactful in the ways that we want them to be.
Thank you so much for that. Felipe, I would like to ask, how much control does the state have over energy and environmental policy versus the private sector?
Thanks, Heidi. So that's a good question. And I'd love to link back to what Dr. Cumberbatch and Jasmine have said, that on one hand, policies are not static. So policies are dynamic and evolving, and policies are not done by the governments or the public sectors by their own. While it is true that in some cases, governments can enact or propose bylaws or specific policies, those are almost always the product of a long and wide discussion with the private sector, with academia, using evidence. At least we've seen some examples of that here in Chile. If you think about the coal phase-out policy, or if you think about the flexibility strategy, you've always have some type of roundtables where there's large discussions. So this back and forth between the public and the private sector is more of a collaboration, actually. And I think that it's good to see it that way. What it is true, and what I think we need to acknowledge, is that the state or the government can play a role which is quite key because of a number of reasons. On one hand, there are some key institutions always within a government's definition or within a state's design that play some roles that are unavoidable and are exclusive to those public institutions. Here in Chile, you have, for instance, the National Energy Commission, which makes the market designs for the electricity auctions, which can have a large impact on the type of energy that you can bring into the system. Or you have the independent system operator, which defines the transmission expansion plan, which ultimately defines if we will be able to connect the points of consumption with the renewable resources that might be in the desert or down in the south. And those are some key roles that we need to identify and really use if we want to deliver change and accelerate the transition. Then there are also some key risks which states can take that sometimes the private sector cannot. So making long-term commitments, acquiring climate goals or long-term energy plans, or signing up on strategies that are really transformative, such as a green hydrogen plan, for instance. Those are things that are harder for the private sector, and the public sector can be a platform for those types of initiatives. And then I'd say that one last thing, which is key, is that the public sector also can harness some key opportunities that are harder for the private sector. So when we're thinking of social conflicts or crucial moments within the history of a country's development, then people look up to their governments and to their leaders to provide them a narrative, right? A way of getting out of that conflict, which is linked to sustainable development. So I think that that back and forth between the private and public sector must acknowledge what the public sector can do to build these key walls that will ultimately define the field in where private actors can develop the projects and the initiatives that the world so much needs.
Thank you. That was a great introduction for our next question. So what are similar ways to cause an impact in environmental policy? And how does your sector work with other sectors, for example, nonprofit with governments, research and state policies, or private and public sector collaborations?
No one wants to go first.
Feel free to
I
go.
was just about to start. Go ahead, Felipe.
Okay, yeah, I can. So I can start, and this is quite linked to what I was saying. But at least on our institution, we tend to work quite well with other sectors. And then you have like a base level of interaction, which is mainly at the level of discussion and setting up roadmaps and really gathering views and perspectives so that you can make a more effective policy design or a more effective strategy. But then there are also specific efforts that you can do to maybe push things a little further. So for instance, working with the private sector, I can tell you the experience of the green hydrogen strategy. So Chile has acknowledged that it requires large amounts of private investments to really materialize its ambitions on green hydrogen. So what we've done is that we've really tried to reach out to the private sector and work with academia as well on publishing some key documents that might help them orient their decisions, really being able to communicate what the market designs of the energy sector are and how are those structured, how the discussions are made on a wider spectrum. So that's one way of taking a look at it. Then also defining from the public sector which, once again, key interventions you can make maybe in the environmental assessment processes to make them more rigorous, but also fast and clear for developers so that they can develop a better sense of where the permits are being given. And finally, putting large amounts of efforts in the connection between the private sector and also local communities, which is something that the Ministry of Energy and the government in general has been working quite strongly over the last couple of years. There are a couple of active conflicts. I'm currently now connecting from the Araucanía region, if you've heard of it. So this is a place that has lots of local communities and indigenous people that have had some troubles with the country in the past, and that's a platform and a dialogue which is already installed. So really using this platform to connect stakeholders is something that can drive this change faster.
Okay, I'll pop in here. So we work with all sectors in various ways. As an academic research institution, we provide advice at international, regional, and national levels. So we've, myself and my colleagues, we've sat on or attended various international conferences. I've had colleagues who were part of the IPCC in terms of climate change. At the regional level, we serve on various bodies that deal with fisheries and other critical resource matters and help to guide international and regional policy, but we also give advice to national governments in terms of, the policies that they may be implementing. Right now, for instance, we're helping Barbados government with the development of a marine spatial plan. I've had colleagues who have been an integral part of negotiating regional fisheries policies, especially, and that can be very contentious in terms of, you know, the exclusive zones of countries. At private sector level, we also work with various private sector entities and non-governmental entities. Typically, we're giving advice or we're assisting in the design and implementation of research. So for example, we are very actively involved in collecting data and doing analysis in areas associated with coral reefs and coral reef restoration. We've been involved in assessing the situation with coral reefs in the Caribbean for a very long time. We have been working on the issue of lionfish. We are currently leading research in the region via several projects that involve universities in other parts of the world, in England, in Ghana, on sargassum, which is an issue affecting the Caribbean and West Africa. And so we've been working on research pertaining to sargassum, but putting out things like good practice guides on how to manage the situation, also looking at how to turn what could be a disaster into an opportunity so working with and connecting actors who are already entrepreneurs in developing products out of sargassum with others who want to understand how to do that better. In other words, perhaps we are best understood as brokers. We use our skills in terms of our research skills and our knowledge products to work with the diversity of actors to assist them in doing what they do better. I think that would be the best way to define the role of my department, ceremonies at the University of the West Indies. It's a small department, and we focus on coastal resources, water resources, climate change, and land management. So we have sort of a broad spectrum. And then I'm sort of cross-cutting in that I bring the social and gender perspective across the diverse areas. I don't remember if I said climate change, but climate change is one of our areas as well. So we are brokers. We work with all sectors, and we play that role of research and knowledge and capacity building.
So I like your term, Janice, brokers. I was going to say that I feel I like my organization or the type of work that we do is more of enablers. Like it's very difficult to ask to civil society members, okay, so what kind of impact are you having? Because it's sometimes difficult to see something tangible, something concrete. It's not like, okay, we passed a law, okay, great, but what else are you doing? And FARN, for example, in particular, we are not a campaign organization. So maybe if you're a campaign organization, you can see more specific things. You did a campaign, you had a good result or a bad result, and that is your impact. I feel like the type of organization I work in, we are doing more of the work from behind the curtains. I don't know if that's the right expression in English, but we're talking to different stakeholders and trying to get them together and to sit around the same table and try to find what are our common objectives. For example, when we go to the negotiations under the UNFCCC, we talk to the negotiators, we try to change that one word in the document that then it's going to end up in a COP decision. And you think, oh, maybe that one word, is that a big impact? Maybe to the general audience, it is not. But then when that word goes down the road and it was in a COP decision, and then it can lead to a national policy and then a sub-national policy. And can you say, okay, was that my doing? Was that my organization's doing? I don't know. I don't know if you can attribute that impact to one person or one organization, but it's the common goal and it's the common work that we are all doing in trying to have that objective reached.
Thank you. Moving forward, what do you believe are the most important action items for the future of Latin America and Caribbean environmental policy?
Well, I can go first if you want. So working in climate change, I think that the biggest thing that we are missing is long-term planning, and that is a challenge everywhere because in general politics work in a, depending on your structure, but in my case in Argentina, in a 4-year mindset. Okay, so what are we going to do for these 4 years that we have now in government? And that's so difficult because the type of policies that we need to have go way beyond one administration or two administrations. It goes well beyond those years. And for example, under the Paris Agreement, parties need to publish their long-term strategy, which is with a goal towards 2050. And that is such a challenge because it's so difficult to plan so much ahead. And in general, well, in Latin America, we have a tendency of not planning so much ahead, but other than like other countries maybe can. But I think that's one thing that we need to transcend administrations, and we need to make those policies good for the people, no matter what party is in government.
So maybe I can follow up. So coming from maybe more a personal reflection, if we're talking about Latin America and the Caribbean, and we're thinking about environmental policy, I think that there are a couple of dimensions that are quite crucial if we want to be successful. On one hand, I think that most, if not all, Latin American and Caribbean countries have a strong cultural tradition related to the environment. And I think that's something that can be harnessed more. If we're thinking about sustainable development, but also energy transitions and whatnot, we really need to think not only our technical systems, right? We also need to change the way that we relate with energy and we relate with everyday energy uses. And I think that if we dig into the cultural tradition of our countries, we'll find some key clues to manage that transition. I think it's important to bear in mind that we are today discussing in a closed group, right? And sometimes we get the feeling that we are all very much aligned. But I think that Latin America and the Caribbean is such a wide place with such a diversity of perspectives and conditions, natural landscapes and whatnot. And it's quite hard to deliver change at such a large scale and in such a decentralized manner. So I think that that's one crucial thing that we need to work on for the next couple of years. And then just trying to be specific. So when we work from the public sector on energy policy, we've come across the challenges of linking these energy transitions with also the development challenges. So really being aware that we're doing this not in isolation of other economic problems, other social issues. And if we want to develop, for instance, a green hydrogen industry, then maybe we need to find a way of linking that strategy with access issues, maybe trying to use this potential renewable energy to supply energy in isolated grids, isolated regions, creating access at a cheap level for 24/7 renewable electricity, for instance, and also connecting with creating values across the territories. So, for instance, in Chile, the places with more renewable potential are probably the region of Antofagasta in the desert, and then the region of Magallanes, which is in the far south. And those are places that have wide diversity of conditions. And if we want to create local value and local growth, we need to create the local capacities for these places to really capture that opportunity and seize this chance to transform their productive identity. So those type of social aspects, I think that will be key to securing that the transition is successful and long-standing.
Okay, so I wasn't even sure where to start. I think I'll piggyback on Philippe's point, and pick up on the social first of all. I think we have to deal with social inclusion. There are too many groups that are still being left behind, that aren't being considered. And when we design policy, we leave them out of policy because they don't have a voice. We don't consider them important enough, whatever the reason. So we have to focus a lot more on social inclusion. That's one factor. Something that has bugged me for the 3+ decades that I've been working in environmental policy is how it's very sporadic. We do things based on projects. We get money, we do something for 3 to 5 years. We get money, we do something else. And sometimes what is the problem is that we're not allowing any one thing to go through thoroughly and have the potential impact it needs to have. Which brings me fundamentally to the issue of money, financing. Right now, the hot topic is climate change, but I have moved from a career that started in the 1990s where we taught broadly about sustainable development, and there's always been a hot topic, and the money follows the hot topic, and you design your projects to get the money from the various inter-American development banks or the CDBs or whoever you're getting your money from based on how it's being defined. And I think sometimes the agenda for Latin America and Caribbean is not defined by Latin America and the Caribbean sufficiently, at least not by the persons who understand it and who are being impacted by the issues. And so making sure that there is that. Someone in one of the questions talked about citizen, what was the word that was used? Citizen participation in the creation of public politics. Yes, we must have more, every 5 years going to the poll and voting in a set of people who may or may not understand the issues, because when you look at it, our politicians are not technocrats. They don't understand environmental issues necessarily. So when you have citizen involvement, that would be a good thing. I agree with the point being made by the person in the chat. And the perspective brought by Jasmine at the beginning about the time frame. If your policy is going to have a 4-year window because it's the policy of the government in power, and then the next government has to come and prove that they have something hotter and sweeter and toss all of the good work that was done before out of the window, you're not getting anywhere. So we have to determine a course of action, and we have to follow that course of action. That is not, and that's again where the research comes in, because we have to look to see how we have to shift, but we don't have to abandon it. And I think sometimes we start things and we abandon them either because it's a agenda being driven by the funder and what is important to the funder at the time, or being driven, as Jasmine said, by the planning horizon of a particular political administration. And in the midst of all of that, you don't achieve the goals that can assist the country in getting where it needs to go, and therefore help everybody, including, as I started my point with, the most vulnerable in our society. So I think those are some of the key things that we have to, keep in front of us as we move forward in terms of environmental policy in Latin America and Caribbean.
Thank you. My follow-up question to that is, what do you think is missing currently to effectively cause change in our state of environment, like climate change, loss of biodiversity, or natural disasters? You briefly mentioned money, but are there any other factors that our panelists would like to discuss about?
Sure, I'll start. I mean, yeah, we always need money. So let's toss that aside and then maybe talk about what we want the money for. There are a couple of things that I think are absolutely missing in the discourse in terms of the environment. I have been missing for a very long time. I would like to see a better marriage between marketing and environment. How many students from a marketing background come into the environmental field? We have hot issues and we tend to have an attitude. Philip mentioned it a little bit, where we think that, you know, we're all of a similar mind. We think our issues are really important. Oh my God, how can climate change not be important? How can it not be urgent? But hello, if I put my other hat on, the issues of children, sick children is absolutely critical, and people dying of non-communicable diseases, those things are critical too. And I could put another hat on and talk about how other things are urgent and important. The point I'm making is that we have to keep ourselves out there. And if we don't market or what we're trying to share, we're not doing it properly. And I love to tell my students, everybody knows about Coca-Cola and everybody knows about toilet paper, but they keep advertising. I mean, who doesn't use toilet paper? Why are we still advertising that, right? Our issues are important, but we have to sell them, people. And we have been doing this for a very long time, but maybe we've not been selling it properly. And we need to bring that skill into our sector. And I think if we do an analysis of the interdisciplinary areas that, you know, where people have, I'm a sociologist and here I am in the environmental field, and you'll find some legal people and whatever. How many marketing specialists do we have? And it's also very important because we're talking about so many different things, right? Climate change itself has elements of sea level rise and, you know, drought, but at the same time, you're talking about drought, you're talking about flooding, and you're talking about storms, and people are like, what? And this is all climate change. And if I shift from climate change, I could go to another topic of corals, or I can go to another topic of sargassum, or I can go to mangroves. Hello, we're confusing people. Maybe we need people who will help us sell our message better, because we certainly are not experts in that. So that's an area that I think is needed more. The other thing that is critical is change. If we knew how to get change to happen, it would have been happening faster. We do not understand the anatomy of change. And that's another area that needs to be more included in what we do. We need the change specialists to decide, oh, hello, the environmental field could do with some help. But as long as we keep thinking that our field needs the biologists and the, you know, marine specialists and the geographers and the physicists and so on, and we forget that marketers and change specialists and behavioral specialists, you want people to change fundamentally. That's what you want to do. The environment is pretty good. It does good on its own. Even after there's been a major event, it will recover. We tend to be the problem. If we're the problem, we're the ones who need to change. Bring the people into the field who can help us understand change, help us when we understand change, market it. So I think those things are missing for me. I have been missing, and I keep saying it, and I'm not seeing enough of it happening even now.
Yeah, building on that, I think that, I don't know if it's a matter of selling the message, but it's a matter of the interrelations and the for people to understand the relations between the different things. For example, we think sometimes about climate change like, oh yes, droughts, or oh yes, rains, and what happens? I mean, and then we think about, okay, so we had a loss of 1 point of our GDP because of extreme drought, and we don't make the connections, or at least the politicians are not making the connections. For example, in my country, one day the president says, yes, climate change is our priority and we want to be greener and better. And the next day they're saying, yes, and we have oil and gas for the next 2,000 years. 200, sorry, not 2,000, 200 years. And where is the link between one thing and the other? I think we need to start working on those relations and making the connections between the different topics that are not being connected, at least not by the general audience, right? And yeah, I wanted to say something else, but I it's kind of slipped my mind. But yeah, I think that those are the connections that are missing.
Yeah, so I can follow up and then just if what you were thinking comes back, then just interrupt me and you can throw it in as well. But I think that we're pretty much aligned with Dr. Cumberbatch and Jasmine on this one, at least from my perspective. So there's one thing that sort of reflects on what has already been said, but it's maybe taking from a different perspective that has to do with accountability and information, and also sort of transparency. So when we think about people giving speeches and making statements or taking commitments, and we are not able to follow up on those commitments, but we do not have the clarity of what is that information, where is it going, or where is it coming from, what's happening with particular operations of particular industries, how are they using their energy. When we're trying to making policy designs for energy transition and we do not have a clear set of information and data, then we cannot make any type of decisions, but we can not also make people or companies accountable for their actions. And that's something that needs to happen. And this also builds on what Dr. Cumberbatch was saying. So of course, there's always a lack of money, but then there's also a lack of understanding of the impact that money has, and the impact of financial markets and financial decisions on climate change. And that's something that's been discussed lately, but I think that we can do better and we can communicate it better to a wider audience, because ultimately it is consumers who also need to drive these types of change. And also coming from an engineering perspective, having more knowledge and more understanding of theory of change is something that's crucial. We need to acknowledge the roles and limitations of the places that we're working in. So for instance, if we're working from the public sector, we need to be agile enough to think in terms of what we can do and what we cannot do. But we also need to be ambitious and courageous and thinking in terms of exponential organizations, and really sending messages across different types of institutions that can work. Even it's possible that they don't work together, they can work in a tensioned environment. So one pulling for one side and the other pulling for the other side. But if we are able to be smart enough in our design of the discussions, then we can really drive things forward. And that's part of theory of change. Many times we lack those type of approaches and we think that the solutions are mostly technical, but ultimately I think that for technical solutions to withstand the pass of time, we need to accompany them with change theory.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Would you like to follow up or shall we move on? Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, so before we open our panel for Q&A, I would like to ask our panelists a final question. What paths would you encourage students to take if they are passionate about addressing environmental issues?
I can start. I think there is not one path. I think that we've said that and we've made it clear. I think it's more of a matter of where do you think that you could be more useful? Or at least that's how I say it. If you can start, I don't know, maybe in social sciences, and then you decide, okay, so this is not for me, or I want to make a change. It doesn't matter. You can do that. It's not like you're making a decision that is for your entire life, because it doesn't work like that. You can change, but maybe you need to find where you feel that you're more useful and where you're most happy at also, because it's important to be happy with what you're doing. It's not like you're going to be happy every day of your life. No, it doesn't work like that. And you're going to have to work a lot, and it's okay. But it's important to find a balance of where do you feel that you can make a change and what makes you fulfilled with what you're doing.
Yeah, so happy to follow up. So thinking about what can we give as suggestions or encouragements, I think that Jasmine is right. There's not a single approach, and there are so many places that could use help and motivation and passion. So if that's at the core of your careers and your career decisions, I think that the rest will turn out fine. I would, however, suggest maybe two things that have been central for me. One of them is to always have like a longer term intellectual curiosity and caring about your passion. So make sure that your passion doesn't burn out. I think that Jasmine makes a good point that you need to be happy wherever you are, and you need to take care of that enthusiasm and energy, because this battle is not for 1 year or for 2 years. We need to do an outstanding job over the next 20, 30 to 40 years if you want to reach net zero. So please take care of that passion and do not lose it. And the other thing that I would suggest is to also nurture diverse interests, because you never know what type of skills you'll need in this type of challenge. I mean, in my short experience, I've had to mostly work as an engineer, but sometimes you have to put on like a lawyer hat or a sociologist hat or an economist hat or thinking about political economy. So really having that broad spectrum of tools can come in handy when you are required to challenge institutions and role of certain units, which is something that we need to do over the next couple of years. We need to ask ourselves, is this the best design for our human, social, and or political systems? Is this the more effective way of addressing such a large challenge? Maybe we need to change something about that. So that would be my two suggestions. I think that with that at the core, then the rest should come out just.
Everything they said, I mean, I don't feel as if I can improve on what they just said at all, other than underscore it. There are multiple paths. Whatever your chosen career is, you live in this world, you can have an impact on the environment. I challenge you, in fact, to think about what you're doing and how it is in no way at all impacted, related to the environment. And I bet you cannot think, you can't find a way it's not. Everybody in some way, what they're doing, even if they're working in a bank, it has an impact on the environment. So multiple paths. Remaining passionate, definitely. You will experience burnout. That would be me putting my hand out, burnt out, tired. Because we are still talking about things that I was talking about when I was your age and I was starting. And if you're going to get frustrated and miserable, maybe find a way of doing it so that you don't, because you have to continue. It is a long haul. There are no easy fixes. The environment is a meta problem. So it takes a long time. And if you're going to get discouraged, then you have to find a way of making your contribution so that you feel that it matters. Because some of us do need gratification. And it's really important, as he says, to protect that passion. Maybe it might be best if you do it on a voluntary basis and not necessarily make it your work. That's okay as well, because we need people who work at environmental policy at a diversity of levels. So I can't improve on what they've said before. I can only say everything they said times 3 in bold. Really, that's it.
Yeah, and just to add one thing is also to take care of yourself. The fight is a lot, and sometimes you find yourself fighting against the world and against within your own organizations sometimes, but it is so important to take care of yourself. We are talking more and more about climate anxiety, and it is real. I mean, it's stressful, it's fearful to think about the future. So it's important to also take care of each other and of oneself, not to get to that point of wanting to give up.
I want to underscore that point. We say the words work-life balance. We only say them, however, we have to make them real. There's a real danger of working 24/7 when you're in this field. You will find yourself receiving emails from colleagues all of the time at wee hours of the night. It is a global thing, so you're going to have people in different time zones sending things to you. And in this age, everybody expects that when they hit the button on this device or on their laptop, they'll get a response right away. I've lived long enough to remember when you wrote a letter, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, put it in a mailbox, and you had to wait for a response. The problems in the environmental field don't get changed, don't get fixed because you've burnt yourself out because you have to respond to everything right away. I'll tell you a little secret. I agreed to do this. I mean, as students, I'm always going to say yes. And then I look say, oh my God, it's a Saturday. I don't work on Saturdays. Yeah, it's students. I'll come and do it. All right. I don't work on Saturdays anymore. And I say that publicly. I don't work on Saturdays and Sundays anymore. Because if I don't recover, I can't work Monday to Friday. And we make those statements, but we have to have the fortitude and the strength to live those statements because you're going to be entering an environment where people are expecting you to do all of the time. The issue is important. Yeah, doctors take time off too, and they're actually dealing with people who could die. All right. So, Jasmine, you're quite right. And there's an underlying thread that I'm hearing here from you. And as a gender person here, I'll say to you, you've got a professional front, and this I'm saying this to all the women on the call. You've got your professional self, and you've got yourself who's responsible to your family, whether it is your spouse or your partner or your children or your extended family. Then you've got your community roles, you know, the triple responsibilities of females. We carry a lot, and we carried a lot in COVID. Do not underestimate that as you are doing your career as an environmental specialist. Do not put that backstage because you will burn out. Then you won't be able to help anyone.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for sharing all this valuable information. It has been great to learn from you all. Now we will be moving forward to our Q&A section of the panel. We will start off with Sonia Compton's question. She says, so I started in the natural sciences and then, similar to Jasmine, transitioned to the social science, specifically marine policy. As I began my transition, I was told social science is not as appealing and not as well respected as the natural sciences in the science community. Then, much like Janice, I began piecing together my areas of interest in the social sciences that aligned with my original love for marine science. All this background to ask, how are each of you initially received/viewed by your peers professionally compared to now/later in your careers?
I can start if you want. Okay, that's a big question, but I've always been the odd one out, so it's okay. I mean, I come from a rather a background from natural sciences, and I was always interested in making the connection with social sciences. I always say this example of, I remember one class at university in which a professor asked us which was the course that we had liked the most until now, because it was one of the last courses in our studies, and everybody was saying, oh yes, ecology, biochemistry, and I said, economy and political, sorry, economy, environmental economy and policy. And he looked at me like I was a weirdo. And it's okay. I went into an organization which is full of lawyers, and I come from environmental sciences. It doesn't really matter, I mean, what your peers think of you in terms of your professional background. It matters what you are actually doing. Also, working in civil society, there isn't much of a civil society or NGO culture here in Argentina. So the first thing that they tell you is, okay, when are you going to get a real job? Because you cannot live from being in an NGO. Well, yes, you can. And so I think it's a matter maybe of phasing out the external noise and focusing on what you're actually doing, and if what you're doing is something that motivates you and something that you like, and it's something that you can actually do because you say that you are actually doing it, so you found your space, you found that connection of the two dimensions that you liked, so go for it, and I hope it works out.
So I'll respond. Hi, Sonia. Thanks for coming this afternoon, bringing some support. I when I did my PhD, I did it in participatory planning. It's like, what is that? They took forever to decide what faculty I should have been registered in. They didn't have a clue. And so I ended up with a political scientist, a marine biologist, and a public administration specialist as my as my PhD panel. And they stuck me in the faculty of pure and applied sciences, and we figured it out. You know what, though, Sanya? What's happened is that I've carved a wonderful niche out for myself in the last 3 decades. I've become a very well respected sociologist in a space of environment, and I get called on to deal with things that are increasingly being recognized as important. There is so much recognition now of the social and the gender elements of things that were previously all natural science. So whether in the journals and the wonderful world of peer reviewed journals, there is still a pecking order, and there's still some old purists out there who think that the physical sciences are superior to the social sciences. I really don't care, because where we live in the Caribbean, you don't work as any pure anything. You actually work far better when you have that blend, and you keep understanding, as Jasmine and Philippe has said before, that things are linked. When we delink things is when we have the problem. So let's leave those people at the fringes to work in their little bubbles. Makes them happy, that's fine. But the rest of us who want to get on with the real work, as far as I'm concerned, and dealing with the real issues, we're always going to have to integrate the natural and the physical. They don't work separate from each other. They never did.
So I just want to emphasize very quickly what Janice and Jasmine have said. So this also resonates quite well with my experience. In many places, these approaches seem kind of new, and some people might be, let's say, like scandalized about that. I can give you an example. In Chile, we did not have a Ministry of Energy or a Ministry of Environment up until 2010. So these are quite young institutions. What I'm trying to say is that you need to challenge the role of current professions. We need to challenge that. And if somebody gets a first impression that says, oh, I don't understand this profile, then that's like only a small part of the challenge. And it's only the first impression. And you can own that. You can say, hey, yeah, I don't care about that. And this is my profile. And I think that this is important. And that is very strong, because we know that these issues are important. So in the mid to long term, when you start really getting to work, then people will value those profiles. They will see that this is actually impactful. So I cannot agree more with what Janice and Jasmine have already said.
Thank you. Jesus Olivares asks, what kind of skills and knowledge do you think is currently missing in the environmental policy area? And what should students be learning / what experiences should they be gaining if they want to work in this area?
Well, I think I kind of hit on this earlier when I said that it isn't so much that we're missing people in the environmental area, we're missing people who need to bring their skills from other sectors to strengthen what we do. And the two that, constantly resonate with me are marketing and change, change management, behavioral change. Those are the two that I would like to see more integrated in our field. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would complement that by saying that whether something is of interest to you particularly, Jesus, or anybody else, then that's something that you can build upon and look for the connections of that particular discipline or methodological approach with the environmental challenges. I think that that's probably a question that's more actionable, and that can give you better insights if you want to have an impact on environmental policy.
Yeah, I think I don't have anything else to add. I think that they've covered everything. And as Janice was saying before, if you think about one thing that is not harming the environment or it contributed to climate change, one area, please tell me, because I haven't. And so if you're working on finance, you can also work on climate finance. I mean, there are so many ways towards working in environmental issues that I think that it actually is needed that everybody makes that.
Thank you. Moving on to Ana Lopez's question. She's asking about citizen participation. Her question is, hello, what about the citizen participation in the creation of public politics? It is not only the state and private sector. What do you think about that? And thank you.
So maybe I can take this one. I totally agree with Anna, and actually that's something that has been going on at I can tell you the Chilean experience. The Ministry of Energy has been quite pioneer on involving citizen participation, first on the development of roadmaps. So we have a roadmap which is for the energy sector for 2020 to 2050 that was done with roundtables across all regions. And then bringing them in for more technical sessions as well. And I think that we can do a better job at other sectors. So for instance, now our mining ministry is also including participatory processes, or our transport industry is also taking a more holistic approach. It's a challenge. I would not say that's easy, and I will not say that's something that can be done directly. You really need to have specialists working on that who understand the sociology of citizen participation and how can you get citizens to be actively engaged in policymaking, and how can they follow up on the policy results afterwards. Because it's not so useful if you have a participation which is one particular snapshot. You really want to have the citizenship involved in the whole process of drafting the policy, but then taking it and actually implementing it and seeing if the results were successful or not, and then maybe doing some modifications. So that's also a part of our challenges looking ahead.
Yeah, and just to build on that, that for this to happen, transparency is so important, because sometimes there can be moments of citizen participation and everybody is happy and they're giving input, and then how is that reflected actually in the policy? How can we know that what the citizens said was taken into account? And sometimes that we cannot do because there isn't enough transparency in how the process actually worked.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, when hearing Jasmine, I had like an afterthought that I wanted to throw in there as well, which is building public policies with citizen participation is also a way of healing trust and building trusting relationships. And I think that's something which lies at the core of transitions and transformations. It's not feasible to make real change and fast-paced projects or innovations if citizenship is not trusting of the agencies or stakeholders that are trying to implement those changes. And this is something that takes long years. And at least here in Chile, like the culmination of that discussion is the current constitutional process, which goes even further than energy or sectorial policies. And that is also being done in a participatory manner, trying to include the citizenship as much as possible, because we've learned from a couple of mistakes in the past.
I will just add to that and say that there was a period in time when we talked a lot about co-management. And perhaps one of the things that we need to do more is ensure that we create that space for the active involvement of citizens. Sometimes when we look at the bureaucratic structures in our societies, citizens' participation is on the fringe, but it's not sufficiently integrated into the process such that there can be ongoing and continuous citizens' involvement and input into policy development and implementation. So I think we're all agreeing with you that it's critical, but I think we just have to find ways to make it more transparent, and we have to find ways to make it more consistent and ongoing. And we may also have to provide enough resources to constantly build the capacity of our citizens to participate effectively as well.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question, Lina Forero asks, ¿cuál sería una recomendación para jóvenes interesados en política ambiental al momento de escoger qué estudiar en la universidad? And you guys would feel free to answer in English.
So I think that this is a point that has been covered already, but I think that this gives an opportunity to maybe throw 2 or 3 additional messages, which would be, so if you're thinking about working on environmental policy and you're choosing between different careers, I would say that one aspect of the decision is, of course, which career are you choosing, but then there are other aspects that can be as equally critical to getting involved in this type of I don't know, sector or activities, which is if you're thinking about different universities, you might want to look how are those universities or those particular schools within universities actively involved with decision making or public policy design, or if they work actively with other institutions, other countries on environmental policy. And then you might wanna chase those type of opportunities to get hands-on experiences, regardless of the discipline that you are choosing. And looking for those opportunities to connect might be a valuable, critical aspect for making that sort of decision. At least that's what I would do if I had to go back in time. I would probably wonder a little bit more about what are the faculty doing, how are they liaising, and how could you particularly harness those channels to get that hands-on experience from an early stage.
Yeah, I think, well, as Felipe said, we've covered, I think, this, but one thing that I think that a university degree should give you more than anything is critical thinking. And I think you can get that from different degrees. It doesn't matter if you're choosing to study, I don't know, political science, or you're choosing to study environmental science. It's a matter of having critical thought and having the ability to think about and question what you're told, not just by your professors or by your government, by your peers. And I think that is the best way, for me at least, to change the system we're living in. In this case, we're interested in environmental issues, but to change the things that we think need to be changed in our societies.
2 responses to that. A shameless plug: come study at our department at UE, and we'll help you figure that out. I think the other thing is that if you are keen, if what you really want to do is be involved in environmental policy, then choose a subject that keeps you excited and integrate the environmental concerns into that. So what's your strength? Philip said he was great at mathematics, and he went off and did engineering, and look at what he's doing now. Jasmine was a marine biologist, but had this curiosity about things on a social side and climate change and so on. I went off and did that. Look where she is now. So take that thing you are passionate about, pursue that. But I think you're all, you're going to grad school from here on in now. So design your field of study to allow you to investigate environmental policy and how you can be a part of it. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up the panel. Bria Ferry asks, what can we do to include and address the needs of underrepresented communities in our work?
So the first thing is to know, you need to accept that it is important. And you have to be willing to engage with, and at 2 levels. You have to be able to talk with the persons who are underrepresented, and we know that there are diversity of groups that are underrepresented, whether it's women, the elderly, whether it's children, whether it's people with disabilities, we could go on and on and on. So you have to be grounded in understanding their issues. You have to be an advocate at that level. But then you have to be able almost to translate that at another level. So if I could use a tangible example, I have a PhD student right now who is working on sargassum, but she's working on it from a perspective of building the ability of people in 3 rural communities in St. Lucia to influence the national agenda for sargassum management. So she did this by working with the communities, bringing policymakers at various levels, whether it was fisheries department or the actual political representative from the area, to those meetings so they could hear the issues from the perspective of the communities. And then at the same time, helping the communities to put their issues in a package that could be taken into the arena where it could be influencing the national management plan. So she worked at multiple levels. She worked with the community. She brought the policymakers into that space, but she helped the community put their issues in a way that it could be taken into the decision-making space. And therefore, you have to be able to do the work across those transitions. And that is whether you're dealing with fishers, whether you're dealing with minors, it doesn't matter who you're dealing with in terms of people who may be disadvantaged in some way. It starts by having a understanding and representing their issues, but most importantly, having them represent their issues and making sure that it can get into the space where it can be a part of the policy management plan, whatever.
Would any other panelists like to answer that question?
No, I mean, I think Janice was super clear. I don't think I have anything else to add. Just to say that bear in mind that not everybody is going to think that this is a necessity. And so you also need to deal with that. Like, for example, when we talk about mainstreaming gender into climate policies, we still are facing people who think that this is not a necessity, and why should we merge the two topics that have nothing to do with each other. This still exists, and it's something that we're still facing. And just to bear in mind that once you start dealing with these issues, there are going to be people pushing against it, but it doesn't matter. It still needs to be done.
I just wanted to make one quick point. There was a very last comment in the chat about problems and challenges and what gives us hope. What gives me hope is that I have seen change. I think if you look for big change, you'll be disappointed. Remember that change can be very small but impactful as well. So don't always look for change to be this massive thing. If you look and you see the little changes that happen along the way, you have to celebrate the small victories. That's very important.
Yeah, I would just a very brief compliment, because I think that Dr. Cumberbatch and Jasmine have covered it pretty well. But I think that one thing that we need to acknowledge is that in many cases, when we think about including underrepresented communities or traditions or cultures into our policy design, we sometimes even lack that in ourselves. And I would say that if we are humble enough to acknowledge that and to start including different types of ideas and thinking systems within our own approaches to problems, then we will be more effective in including those groups afterwards. I've seen a couple of initiatives that have been very vocal about them, including large number of communities, and then sometimes these initiatives fail because it's something that's done at only a superficial level. If we really want to include that, we need to go deep into the cultural aspects of the energy transition and of sustainable development.
Thank you. And before we wrap up our panel, are there any final remarks our panelists would like to say to our audience?
So maybe I can give a couple of words just to close up. First of all, it's great to have been here with Dr. Cumberbatch, Jasmine, and great moderation, Heidi, by the way, many thanks for that. And I would just say that, be adventurous and be courageous. We need to challenge the status quo, and we need to challenge the traditional way of doing things. That can be sometimes scary, but I think that nowadays it's becoming more and more evident that that's a necessity that we have as a society. So that's becoming valuable. If you're a professional that's able to question things and have a critical approach using science-based evidence, then you are of high value to any industry, be it the financial industry or a more engineering-based industry, logistics, whatever. So be courageous, be adventurous, and know that there's a whole group of people trying to work on these sustainability problems. Remain passionate and take care of yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I would also add to find those networks, to find also those people who are working on these different things. And it's so important to have to be in company, like with others, to do this together. Because I often get this question of, why do you do what you do? Well, my simple answer is I want to change the world. Am I going alone to change the world? No. So it's important to build those networks and to have that those friendships and those connections that are going to help you navigate that world.
And I'll just say, be creative and have fun. It is a lot of work and it can be around some depressing topics. But if you could find ways of being creative in what you do, and if you find people love a like mind and you can have fun along the way, it actually isn't so bad. I've been in it for a long time and I'm still in it. And I do have some fun times at times. So just try really hard to be creative and find new and innovative ways to, to effect policy and change.
Thank you. Well, that wraps up our panel. Thank you all so much for joining us today. A special thank you to our panelists. It has been an honor to share this virtual space with you. Next, we will have our environmental justice panel, so please make sure to join us again in 5 minutes. Thank you all again and have an amazing evening.